for today's webcast will be Mark Roberts from IBM. If you have any questions, just enter them in the chat and we'll answer them at the end. Thank you. I'll pass over to Mark now.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Roberts from IBM. I'm in the Rational brand within Software Group, and for about the last 15 months or so, I've been specifically focused on the UrbanCode products, primarily working on UrbanCode Deploy, but also working on UrbanCode Release, and now working on some of the newer things that have come out in the last few weeks as well. So what I wanted to do during the next sort of 40 minutes or so is to give you an introduction to UrbanCode Deploy, the product, with a specific focus on things that it can do for Oracle WebLogic customers. This is an area that we find is getting some interest from WebLogic users who are keen to solve some of their deployment problems. And this is something that came out of conversation with Ranger 4 over the last few weeks. And in speaking to Helen Beale at Ranger 4, we identified that she was aware of a number of people who had some deployment challenges around WebLogic and would be interested in these particular plugins. So as soon as they were released, we decided to organize a webinar to introduce them to you. So we won't be showing them running today within an Oracle environment, because within IBM we don't have such things. But what we can do is we can show you exactly how these plugins will be used and what sorts of capabilities the WebLogic plugins have. There are various things that we can show running today, and we'll probably demonstrate a few things a little bit later on in this webinar. So I'm going to start off with just a few slides to set the scene. Then we'll go into having a look at the WebLogic specific content that we have, and then we'll start to show that running in the product. If you do have any questions as we go through, please type them into the chat window. I may not spot them straight away, but I will keep glancing at that as we go through, and I'll try and answer any questions. I'll read out the question and then for everyone else to hear, and then we'll try and answer it if we can. Okay. So you've heard a lot of chat around this phrase DevOps. It's a little bit of an overloaded term now. It means different things to different people. For me, really, it comes about from the emergence of Agile development. And really, prior to Agile development, we had waterfall-driven processes where we had all the creative behavior on the left-hand side and the innovation of development, and that was coupled and mirrored, really, around that dotted line in the center with an operations team that was centered around procedural rigor and specific things that they had to do at specific points in time. Now, there's still a place for that type of approach. There's still a place for that type of mentality around things like operational deployments into production environments. But equally, things need to move a whole lot faster, and bringing these teams together so that really deployment becomes the responsibility of everyone is a key element of software development these days. So really, instead of thinking about software development from an Agile perspective, really we start to think more about software delivery. It's no longer sufficient just to develop software and throw it over the wall to someone else to deploy, who then needs 6 months and a huge amount of cost to the organization to get that system deployed into a production environment. It's slow, it's unwieldy, it's costly, it's risky, and there's no need for it these days. So with Agile development, we have this compression of the top part of the diagram, and we have these blended roles and repeated operations that are being performed. So really now the development and the operations teams work much closer together. Now, DevOps is often seen as a reason to get these teams together. There's also some damn good reasons to keep them apart, to be honest. So you need that separation when you're talking about the resources that are being used in production and the deployment into production environments. But what you also need is a repeatable process that the development teams are doing every hour or every few minutes, so that when they deploy into test environments or into single machine development environments, they are using exactly the same processes that will later be used to deploy into production. We need to move away from this philosophy of deploying the the steps we use and the scripts and the automation that we use to deploy into production is only used in production. Because how do you test that? Well, you deploy into production, which is the last thing you want to do when you're testing something. So we need to establish environments whereby we have this repeated operations being performed by our development teams into the earlier environments. That generates a huge amount of confidence around those procedures that we're using, such that you do then get the authority to use those procedures into production environments. So if we look at some of the delivery challenges that we have within organizations these days, we really have two gaps. The first gap has been neatly addressed by Agile development in bringing the line of business and development teams much closer together. So this has allowed us to bring stakeholders from the business into development teams, allowed us to show them the applications much earlier on. But if we want to do that, the best way to show them the applications running is in some type of runtime environment. So again, deployment issues can have an impact on that. But largely, that gap between those two areas of the business that historically really didn't want to talk to one another particularly well, apart from across the margins of a 300-page Word document that the business had given the development team and said, go and implement that. We have got them working much closer together now, but really that's pushed the bottleneck much further down into the gap now between development and operations. Because really, if you've got development teams that are using continuous integration and they're generating hundreds of builds a day potentially, where are they all going to go? And we get this huge funnel effect. So generating builds is great, and the ability to compile and link and generate an executable is a huge achievement for some teams that I've come across. But actually, what does that prove? Well, it doesn't really prove anything until you've been through a cycle of functional testing, acceptance testing, performance testing, security testing, to really prove that the application performs as it should, reliably, for the right number of people in a secure manner. And the only way to do that is within a larger runtime system, and that involves deployment. So if you're slow at deploying, you're really slowing down and narrowing that funnel of all of those agile builds and negating some of the benefits that you get from having those continuous integration processes. So it's a second gap really that we're trying to address with DevOps, and that's the reason why we're here, and those are the reasons why customers come to talk to us. So typically speaking, the customers that I've been dealing with over the last 6 months, they can all deploy their software now. They can deploy into development, into QA, into pre-production, and into production. But the question is how they do that. And often it's with different processes and procedures. Often those procedures are slow. Often those procedures revolve around very, very complicated scripted operations that are themselves fragile. If they creak, if you prod them in the wrong place, they're going to break completely, and nobody really knows how to fix them. Additionally, that as a consequence has an impact on the team because it stifles innovation, and it really stops the team from being able to adapt those processes and modify them to take on new technologies and new procedures and new ways of working. So it slows things down, it gets in the way, and causes issues. So what's the impact of deployment automation and release automation? Well, if you look at the total cost of ownership of an application over time, then to implement it takes around 21% of the cost, and then operationally to run it and maintain it and keep it running the way you need to is around about sort of 79% mark. You can break those figures down further. I think most people would agree with that sort of 20 to 80 split there between implementation and operational cost over a period of time it takes costs to, to run an application. But then if we layer onto this the areas really where release automation and deployment can have an impact, then we've stacked up 83% of the total cost of ownership of that particular application. Now, I'm not saying that 83% of that cost is all down to deployment and release, but what I am saying is that 83% of the total cost of ownership of an application are areas that can be considerably screwed up by poor deployment and release automation. So these are areas where the deployment can have a huge impact, and these are obviously good reasons to try to improve and lower the cost and lower the risk of deployment. So how do we do that? Well, we use UrbanCode Deploy. And UrbanCode Deploy, the deployment automation solution that now sits within the IBM Rational Software Group brand. It was acquired from UrbanCode, the company, on April the 22nd last year, so it's been in the IBM family now for around about sort of 14, 15 months, 14 and a half months. And since that time, it's seen some considerable changes. There's been quite an acceleration of change within the product itself, and it's grown to support a much wider set of technologies that it can work with. Now, deployment automation is really only as good as the sort of fingers out that it can reach into the infrastructure and the systems that it deploys into. If it's a very narrowly focused product, it's probably not going to satisfy many of your specific requirements for the individual customers who are on the call today. What it does, however, is probably from its heritage of being a non-IBM product, and probably now from the heritage that it is within IBM, it has a huge reach out of something like 85 plugins to different technologies that it can automate and deal with. And interestingly, whilst we might look upon Oracle as a competitor to IBM within the data management area, then we've embraced Oracle WebLogic and decided to support customers of that particular technology and helping them to deploy their applications onto that technology. And that's what we're going to have a look at today. So in terms of sort of breaking things down within UrbanCode and the way the application is constructed, we have the notion of the application to be deployed. And that application is something that delivers some value either as an internal or an external system. So if you were, say, an organization that sells products on the web, you might have a large catalog of products that you deploy. Then you probably have many, many systems that support that. So you'll have a presentation web system. You will then have back office systems that will take orders, that deal with customer interaction. And these are the different applications that you can think of. So there's how people buy your products, there's how people return them, there's how people browse the catalog, there's internal systems to update the catalog of products. These are all individual applications. And those applications are made up of a number of components. So you can then start to think about the various different components. And some of those components will be on WebLogic. Some of those components might be on WebSphere technologies. There might be database, in which case you'll have SQL scripts that you want to manage and execute against your databases. There'll be ad hoc things for moving file content around. There might be some HTML content, video content, all sorts of things that forms the individual small pieces of content that together form an application. And each of those pieces of content has a process, and that process is detailed and is specific to the technology that is being deployed. So if that's simple HTML pages, that process is just going to be to move things around, maybe delete old content, refresh new content, and so on. If it's WebSphere technologies, it might be stopping services, deploying new technologies, restarting services. The same applies to WebLogic. And specifically to WebLogic, there are some very specific configuration activities that need to be performed. And center of the screen there, we show versioned artifacts. And this is one of the key things to UrbanCode Deploy that's kind of made it very an interesting area of conversation with customers, because a lot of customers have gone down the road of creating different repositories for the content that needs to be deployed, be that binary content, be that text content. UrbanCode Deploy has its own versioned artifact storage mechanism. So every artifact that you deploy, every component that you're deploying, can have multiple versions of the artifacts that need to be deployed. And this makes sense for a number of different reasons, one of which is that you're likely to have different versions of that content in each environment at any one time. So production might have the release that was done 2 months ago, pre-production might have the version that was done 1 month ago, and development will have what's been done today. So there will be different versions of the artifacts, and those versions of the artifacts will progress through those environments, gaining status as they go and effectively gaining the authority for that version to move into the next environment up the chain towards production and finally into production. It also helps us to identify the barrier really between the development community and the deployment community, because within development we are really dealing with source code artifacts, we're dealing with the development and storage of those source code artifacts, and those can be held in products like Rational Team Concert, Subversion, Git, and so on, and various other different source configuration products like that. But really the boundary between that and between the deployment automation here is effectively the generation of the binary object that you want to ship out. So I can have a source code management system, something like Rational Team Concert, that stores the source code, it stores the instructions on how to build the application, and it generates a jar file or a WAR file or an EAR file of some kind. But typically those binary files are not stored back inside source code management elements of Rational Team Concert. They're very rarely stored in any source code configuration product like that. Typically what then happens is those are handed over, pushed forward into UrbanCode Deploy, for UrbanCode Deploy to store those in its versioned artifact store. And we can make that a completely seamless flow of information. So a developer commits a series of changes in Rational Team Concert or into Git or into Subversion. That then triggers off a continuous integration build cycle, and that continuous integration build cycle can have an additional stage tagged onto the end of it, which pushes the content into UrbanCode Deploy as new versions, and then allows us to initiate a deployment based on that. So it's very, very easy to create a chain of communication between the products and a sequence of events whereby a developer commits some code, and if we want it to happen, we can then have that built, loaded into UrbanCode, and deployment run into our first environment without anyone putting their hand on the machine. Very quick, very easy, but it allows us to get over this problem of agile development, builds and builds and builds that go nowhere. Well, now they do go somewhere. They get deployed into a runtime environment and can be executed and tested properly. So moving forward, let's have a look now at the specific things that we offer around WebLogic and step through this screen. And if you are WebLogic customers, then these things will start to become familiar to you straight away. We presented this a few weeks ago to a customer that was WebLogic, and they kind of leaned forward at this point, started reading down the screen and seeing what specific things we could cover, and then they kind of gave you a bit of a sage nod of the head and said, yes, this is quite interesting. So very simple steps that we can provide to allow you to deploy from into an Oracle WebLogic server. So we can stop an application, we can start applications, we can deploy to it, undeploy, and redeploy. So the basic deployment operations of applications into an Oracle WebLogic runtime environment. Beyond, and that top one really is fairly easy to understand and fairly typical. And Tejinder just prompted people to ask questions in the chat system if they have any questions. So the other things we can do is we can manage the service bus, and this allows us to import an XML file or a jar file to update configuration data. Now this brings about some other capabilities of UrbanCode Deploy within that particular area. Is what information is in that XML file that you're constructing that you want to deploy and use to update the configuration of the Oracle Service Bus. Well, there are several ways that you can do that. One is you could manage that XML file as just any other source file in a source code management system, such as Team Concert, ClearCase, Subversion, Git, any tool like that. We could then push that through into UrbanCode Deploy as a versioned artifact held within UrbanCode, and we can then use it within this deployment operation. The other option that we can take with this actually is that we can choose to store a parameterized or tokenized version of that particular of the XML file. And this allows us to replace areas where there are variables within the file with tokenized elements. So we can have an @ symbol, then a token name, then another @ symbol, and that then becomes a replaceable piece of content that UrbanCode Deploy can swap out for us and replace with some real value. And where do those real values come from? Well, they come from a number of different places. They might be environment-specific variables. So, for example, and forgive my lack of Oracle WebLogic knowledge, but there might be something like a database connector in there within the service bus. And this allows us to make that an environment-specific variable. So database connections typically are, you're not going to use the same database in development, in QA, and in production. So we create that, and we identify specifically where those databases are located in each of the 3 environments, in dev, QA, and production. And then we substitute into this tokenized file at runtime, at deploy time, the actual value that we need. And I'll show you something around that in a few minutes. We also have resource management for Oracle WebLogic servers. This is around 60 steps for the management of a variety of different things. I can show you these on the next screen. The resource management plugin offers effectively a create, delete, and update on all of the things that are listed there, and that adds up to quite a large number of plugin steps. So we can create a distribution crew, we can delete it, we can update it, and the parameters that are required to be provided to UrbanCode so that UrbanCode can perform these operations are all collected in the steps. I'm going to go and show you some of these steps in just a few seconds' time. We also have security management for Oracle WebLogic servers, whereby we can manage the authentication, users and groups. An area that doesn't seem that significant, but if you ask administrators how much time they spend managing these sorts of things around authentication and users and groups within different test environments that you have, it's going to add up to quite a lot of time. And finally, we have resource management for Oracle WebLogic integration. And this breaks down into these different event generators, so the create, the update, and delete of objects within the various event generators for file, FTP, JMS, and some XML cache entries. So let's go and show you what some of these look like now, and hopefully you can continue to see my screen as I do this and select a particular virtual machine. I'm going to pick this one here, number 68. And this is showing you UrbanCode Deploy. Now, if you haven't seen this before, then let me give you a brief walkthrough UrbanCode Deploy and show you what we have within this particular setup. So as you can see, we access UrbanCode Deploy via a web interface, and this allows us, anybody, very quick access to it. There's no cost associated with individual people using UrbanCode Deploy, so it's really open to as many people within the organization to use it as you want to. The licensing mechanisms that we use are more focused on the systems that you're deploying into, how many there are or what types there are, and various things like that. If you want to know more about that, then follow up with us after the call if you want to know more about how it's actually licensed. So it shows an application here. If I look at my deploy worldwide travel application, the first thing I'm presented with is the different environments that I can deploy into, that the application will progress through to go from development through into production. And if I open one of these up, it will show me the versions of the content that have been deployed to each of those environments. So I can see that we've got some different versions deployed between my development and my QA environment. Now, in your organizations, an application to you might not consist of 3 components, it might consist of 33 components or more, however many it may have. So for you, what might be more useful is to use this compare facility. And this starts to show us now that immediately we can see admin is the same, web content is the same, but booking has a slightly different version between those 2 environments. So let's have a look at one of the individual components now. And if I drill into my administration component, the area really that I want to take you into today to show you some of the things around WebLogic is into the processes. And I've got a process here called Deploy to Tomcat. And it's quite a simple process in this one, in that it downloads the artifacts that need to be deployed from the version storage of UrbanCode Deploy. It then stops the application running. If the stop of the application is successful, we go down this route down here and we undeploy the application. Once we've undeployed it, we'll deploy the new version to the Tomcat server, start it, and finish. If over here the stop of the application fails and is not successful, then we go down this route here and we assume that it's not been deployed. If you can't stop it, we assume that it's not there all in the first place. We then go and deploy it, start it, and finish. Now, okay, I know that this session is focused around WebLogic and I'm showing you a Tomcat example. But what I want to do now is just use this process to show you. So I'm going to use this to show you some of the variability. I'm now going to show you some of the WebLogic elements to it. So I can search for WebLogic within the left-hand side palette there that shows us all the different plugins that we have. And that now provides me with a filtered list of plugins that are available. So they're all listed underneath Application Server as the sort of root context of these particular processes. And now if we have a look at some of these things, you'll see what's available to us. So the first thing that we had, which was quite straightforward, let me pick the right one. There we are. So on the top of our list on PowerPoint, we have the stop, the start, the deploy, the undeploy, and the redeploy. And let's just take the deploy. And if I just press and hold and drag that onto the diagram, I can let go up here, and this shows that I can deploy it. And now I'm going to be asked for the deployment name, and if we float the mouse over these things on the right-hand side, then these question marks will show us the sorts of the bit of help around them. So I need to specify an admin URL for the WebLogic server. It gives us a clue there, most likely hostname : port. So I could put in here so if that was my hostname and port, then I could put those in here. I could put in my admin username and the admin username's password, which won't be seen on the screen, and so on. And the red asterisks there are a clue to which ones there are mandatory that we have to fill out. If I don't have supply the source and I try and save it, it will tell me that source is a required field. So I can fill that in. Now, other things that are worth mentioning on here are that these will differ. These fields that we have recorded here will differ depending upon which step we're performing from within which specific plugin, be that WebLogic or any other. Other things that are important to note across here are that we can also do things like post-processing scripts. So I've got a number of post-processing scripts that I've written here for a variety of different customers. Post-processing scripts are held centrally. So if there's typical common operations that you might want to perform after a particular step, then those are held centrally and available to all scripts to use. There's also preconditions, so we can specify specific preconditions that have to be met before the step is performed. Now, we had some variables listed in there, and one of the things I wanted to show you in here is how we can start to use those variables and turn them to our advantage. Now, previously in that particular item, that particular step, we had the WebLogic URL that had to be used. So on the basis that a URL is just a URL, here's one for Tomcat that I've used here. But it's easily replaceable to a WebLogic environment. And the likelihood is that you're going to have different WebLogic servers running in different environments. So you'll have, a machine in development that developers are targeting. Then there'll be a WebLogic machine in QA. Then there'll be a WebLogic machine in pre-production. And there'll be a WebLogic machine in production. Those are environment-specific machines. So we make the addressing of those machines through the URL environment specific by making those environment variables. So it's a bit of an odd syntax here, but we have $ curly bracket p : environment / server. And that's saying that I'm going to define a variable called server in each of my environments, and depending upon which one I'm deploying into, it will pick up that value from the environment and use it for me. We also have the same thing for the port specified here. So if we now go and have a look at that particular environment, let's go across to my worldwide travel, go into my development environment, and into the configuration of that, then here we see the server and the port name that have been specified, which are mandatory. They have a little red asterisk on. So if I define a new environment and I don't specify these values, then I won't be able to deploy into that environment. So there we can see the port and server for my development environment. If I go across to my QA environment and look at the same thing, then I've got a different port number. Okay, it's the same machine because I've only got one of them on here that's sitting in front of me right now, but you can start to see the picture of how that would operate. So that's the sort of WebLogic around the very simple things of deploying and redeploying and starting and stopping and undeploying applications. I'm just going to come out of this virtual machine for a second, just see if there's any questions in the chat window there. No, okay, let's just carry on. Let's go back into that. And let's show you a few more of the other things that we can do here around WebLogic. Well, here we've got the sort of many items here around WebLogic resource management. So again, if I drag one of these on, create a file, and in here we've got things like the user ID, the password, which won't be shown on the screen, again, a URL, and admin server name, file names, and so on and so on. We can see which ones are specific here and which ones are mandatory. Slightly different way of representing the variables there, in that we've got the domain path specified as a resource variable. Now, this is quite interesting because a resource variable is tied to the specific machine that the task will be running on. So never mind that I'm in my production environment, we want to know which particular resource we are targeting with this command. Because things like the domain path or the Python path there, that path might be different depending on which team built that particular machine, where that particular Python executable has been installed, and so on. So we don't want to have to put kind of if statements into our deployment processes saying if you're deploying to this particular machine, then assume the path to be here. If it's this other machine, we do it in a different way now. It's on this machine over, it's on this particular path over there. So we don't want to include that sort of variability in our scripts. It's a recipe for disaster, it's a recipe for things to break. So we specify those as resource parameters. And again, when we define a resource, we can specify which particular parameters are going to be mandatory, and if they're not defined, the deployment won't run again. And finally, just to finish off browsing through here, we've got things like security management, so you can see how easy it is to do these sort of things. I can manage roles, again specifying the role operations to be performed, specifying some metadata XML file to be produced, and again, the pop-up help will show us exactly what is required to be done in each particular step. So it's very easy to do this, simply dragging them across onto the drawing surface on a particular process, defining the order that you want things to run, and then starting to run those on specific environments, filling in the variables and the parameters as we go, and using it that way. Now, I mentioned the token replacement on the XML files. I just want to show you a little bit about that, because managing configuration data within XML files is a really useful way to do it. Having that parameter substitution from UrbanCode is really useful as well. I'm going to search for XML within here. On the left-hand side palette, there's something like 80-odd plugins that are available now. So having a search facility in here is particularly useful. And if I do sorry, I'm looking for the wrong thing. Search for token. There we go. Replace tokens. So if I drag that one across, on here now, this identifies, allows us to identify a number of things about how we're going to do this token replacement. So I can specify which files are to be replaced. **/* involving, it basically says do every file in every directory. So that might not be relevant. I might want to pick a particular directory, or I might go and replace that with star.xml to specify you're only going to go and look in XML files. I can specify what the token delimiter is. Generally we use an @ sign, and then I can specify the property file names to be replaced. I can also specify individual specific property lists. So this one is going to look for all environment properties. So it will open up every XML file, and it will look within those for the occurrence of any environment variables that we have. So I might have defined, say, 20 environment variables within my application process. It's going to go and look for each one of those 20 within every XML file here, and it will replace it with the value that's specified in that environment if necessary. I can also put in here explicit environments, and I can do this in a manner that says something like let's pick a reasonable token name, dbpath @ and I can replace that with so if I define an environment variable called dbpath, spelled in that way, then when I run this particular replace tokens process, any XML file that has the string @db_path@ will be replaced with the value that I've provided for my DB path within the current environment. So I could then go and identify the database path within my dev environment, within my QA environment, and within my pre-production and production environments, specify where all those are as effectively pointers to the right database location, knowing that the XML file is going to be downloaded into my onto the environment where it's going to run, and then it's going to have those tokens replaced with the specific values so that the right database connection is used. So this is a great way to produce XML files, and then you could use the XML file-based configuration of an Oracle WebLogic environment that we saw on the last screen. So that's really showed you all of the things that I wanted to in UrbanCode Deploy today. Really, we've had a look around the detail of the process. We've had a look at some of the steps that are relevant to WebLogic. Been through in the presentation mode the actual steps that are available for WebLogic. Just see if there's any questions at this point. No. So let's carry on and just recap what we got there. So if you're running an Oracle WebLogic environment, this is a great way to take control, to get rid of those ad hoc scripts that you're using to manage the deployment into those WebLogic environments, and to remove the need to rely on those. And the other thing that you get by using UrbanCode Deploy, of course, is you get the ability to manage the deployments into those environments, but those deployment operations are fully audited, completely controlled. There's governance around who can perform those operations. There's governance around who can perform which deployments into which environments. There's a complete log of all operations that have been performed as well. So the security layer around the deployments, the audit records that are produced for the deployments are really relevant and particularly useful to us. Now, since we have a couple of minutes, what I want to do now is just make you aware of one other area of product functionality that we have within UrbanCode, which is really focused around the application release process. And you might start to think that the application release process looks a little bit like this: deploy to dev, test, deploy to QA and test, deploy to production and go home. Well, the reality is slightly different. It doesn't really work like that. More normally what's going to happen is that we're going to produce a plan. And we're going to produce a plan for the runbook of manual steps and operations that need to be performed and are assigned to individual people to actually perform a release of our application. You might be thinking that, well, what you just showed me is fine. That will deploy one application, but I want to deploy 20 applications at the same time. And those are 20 complicated applications, and I've got manual network reconfiguration work to do for traffic rerouting, for load balancer switch-offs, for draining down traffic on specific environments. You then need to deploy your applications to servers, which are typically scripted operations. Then there's a huge amount of validation work, which can take an awful lot of time, and further scripted operations to be performed, final switchovers and approvals to do that. And then, of course, there's all that documentation to keep up to date with who did what, where, and when. That's more normally what happens through a deployment process. These are the reasons why many organizations take so long to perform deployments. It's not necessarily the automation processes and the scripts that they run. Where things are scripted, they will run very, very quickly. My machine seems to have done something a little bit odd. I can still see PowerPoint, but everything else has disappeared around it. Let me just drop out of that for a second. Okay, hopefully I'm still projecting and you can still see my screen and everything else behind it. Let's go back to that. So the actual scripted operations of performing deployments for many people don't take very long, as arduous as they are, but it's the manual things around that take an awful lot of time. So when you think about application release automation and trying to speed that up, really what you're focused on is those three areas of efficiency, productivity, and predictability. Efficiency is all around the automated operations and saving the labor costs, saving huge amounts of cost of onshore and offshore resources that are performing manual operations and validation operations and testing operations. Trying to improve the productivity by allowing the team to do all of that faster and identify defects earlier in the life cycle by deploying to more test environments. And finally making the whole thing a lot more predictable, lowering the risk and decreasing the variance of software projects, and making things a little bit more standardized. And the way that we do this is with UrbanCode Release. Now, IBM UrbanCode Release is a layer of software that really sits above UrbanCode Deploy, in that Release allows us to manage manual and the automated operations that need to be performed to actually carry out a deployment and release of an application. So this release replaces these error-prone and manual spreadsheets, which can be the bane of the life of operations people. They replace things like the project plan because it shows the dependencies between individual tasks. It shows who's responsible for performing a task, and it shows the status of each task. So everyone can see exactly what's going on. So instead of a senior manager picking up the phone and saying, where are we with this particular deployment? Well, they can still do that, of course, but they can also go to this website, web interface, and have a look at exactly what state we're in for the deployment. So it really kind of converts the spreadsheet, the Word document that details operations to be performed, the project plan that describes who is responsible for doing each task and dependencies, makes all of those things into a web-based, browser-based tool that allows, it's a multi-user collaborative product that allows everyone to see what's going on, everyone to perform their specific task at the right time, report the status of it, and manage the deployment of many applications through the release cycle. So if you've got a release weekend that involves starting things at 10 o'clock on Friday night and progressing them through, and you have to keep looking for text message updates, you have to keep phoning people up to keep seeing what's going on, and maybe you have to drive in on late on Saturday evening because something's gone wrong and you need to look at a log file, then replace all of those operations with this. It has deep integration into UrbanCode Deploy, so it allows us to see exactly what deployment operations are being performed at any one time. It allows us to call specific deployments and puts a layer above UrbanCode Deploy, which makes it more basically giving you a layer of management of the entire release rather than just a layer of management of the automation. So that concludes what I wanted to show you today. What version of WebLogic does this cover? I'm kind of glad you said that, because given me the opportunity to show you this, which I'd forgotten about. So I'm glad that came up. If I go to my bookmarks for UrbanCode Deploy and take you to the UrbanCode Deploy plugins section. So hopefully you can see the URL at the top of the screen at the moment. This is the UrbanCode plugins area. If you just Google for UrbanCode and the word plugins, then you'll get taken to this screen pretty quickly. We can see all plugins that exist for all the different UrbanCode products, or we can just focus in on the UrbanCode Deploy plugins. And in here, if we type in WebLogic, it filters down the list and takes us to this, and we can then go to look at the detailed information about the plugin, and it tells us information about it. Now, we also have detailed documentation for each plugin. Let's go and have a look at this. There we go. This plugin supports WebLogic server versions 10G and later. So the answer to the question was, what version of WebLogic does this cover? The answer is 10G and later. So hopefully that satisfies the requirements for that particular question.
Thank you, Mark.
The documentation for the plugins is pretty extensive. If you step through from one of the plugins to the documentation, you get this overview panel that shows you information about it, and then the detail for each of the steps that exist is shown within here. So this shows you if you're going to perform an undeploy operation, these are the parameters that are required, and these are some of the optional parameters. So you can look at that then, and you can decide, yeah, those are the sorts of things that I currently do with that nasty shell script that's difficult to use. This will be make that a whole lot simpler. So you can really assess what the plugins can do at this particular point. The other way you can do that is you can download the UrbanCode Deploy product. You can get it installed in about 5 minutes, get it up and running, and actually try it out for deployment operations in your environment. But if you need any help with that, then please contact either myself or Ranger 4, and we will endeavor to help you as much as is needed to get things up and running. That really concludes what I wanted to show today. So I hope this has been useful as an introduction to UrbanCode Deploy in general, and more specifically to have a look at the sorts of things that we can do around WebLogic. Thank you, Tejinder.
Thank you, everyone, for listening, and thank you, Mark, for this wonderful presentation. Cheers.